Hi, Shayna. Thank you so much
Hi,
for joining me.
Lauren. Yeah, happy to
I'm
be
so
here.
excited to be talking to you today and catching up and talking about our partnership. I was driving home from campus from a meeting with the Wisconsin Entrepreneurship Hub, and I saw the Wienermobile. And I was like, I think this is a sign. I'm getting ready to talk to Shayna, who is like the most Wisconsin person that I know, and it's just perfect timing.
Partly it's my job to talk about Wisconsin, but also it is so fun to be here talking with a friend and co-conspirator around entrepreneurship and innovation and like learning new things and trying new things. And so just happy to spend some time talking about our journey as program collaborators, but also just as curious innovation supporters.
Yeah. And I think of you that way too. I usually refer to you as my friend and longtime colleague. So you've known me for 7 years since I started at Generator, shortly after I moved to Wisconsin. You were part of the group that hired me at Generator. So what's similar and what's different about how we work with each other now?
Yeah, I think when we first started working together, I can't believe it's already been 7 years or only 7 years. It's like both and, right? I think that was right as I had my first kiddo. And then everything else is a blur. But I think what's similar is that we were working together on some core concepts that and beliefs. Proximity matters for founders and for ecosystem builders. Access is critical to that proximity, and warm introductions beat everything. And so, what's shifted, I think, is well, our roles have shifted, our organizations have grown and transformed and pivoted, but I think, our scope back then was very specific on a program. And that program had very clear outputs, more investable startups for my venture team to consider, right? And that's a really clear, typical generator customer relationship. And I think what's evolved is the intentionality and range of how we work together now, right? My role has changed. I've shifted away from a specific fund and moved into a statewide role on strategy and ecosystem and capital. And so we get to explore different ways of supporting that same clear output, right, of investable startups. But we get to wonder and try how do we think about that repeatable outcome at a statewide scale that treats accelerators and introductions as economic infrastructure. And so I think we've evolved not just by getting to know each other and trust one another's sort of insights and perspectives, but the work itself has shifted from a single cohort output to an envisioned, 10-year or generational impact on our entire state's fabric.
Yeah. Yeah. So, like you said, we've been having these conversations around all of these pieces of economic development and more this whole time in different ways. And you've been in economic development for a while. So, focusing on where you are now, tell us a little bit more about what the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation does and how you ended up there.
Yeah, well, actually, today is my 2-year anniversary with the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. I I'll tell you a little bit about what they do first. So at WEDC, we have a mission and vision to build an economy for all where every Wisconsinite has the opportunity to thrive. And that spans from large scale business attraction, right? Attracting in that $4 billion investment from a multinational company like Eli Lilly, to helping small businesses start to export their products, goods, and services across our borders in a global economy, to the things that I get to lead in my division and team, which is focusing on two things. Really, I like to think of us as the scout team in innovation. So, what are those frontier technologies that can benefit from connectivity, shared imagination, and collaboration? And then the output of that innovation economy becomes high growth entrepreneurship. So my lane is really focusing on those early stage companies and building an ecosystem around them. And I think it's about making Wisconsin that place of choice where founders can move faster because we're a small economy. And that becomes a strength because you can really quickly find the right people, open and accessible angel networks for that first check, and corporate customers within reach. And so my career has really been an interesting one. It spanned building buildings, building public policy for the state, launching a corporate venture fund focused on social impact, thinking deeply and capitalizing public-private partnerships with philanthropy and governments. And so all of that has helped me be a more proximate, thoughtful leader in this role that's looking at how do we use public will and public good and resources at the state level that still relies on the proximity of the founders on the front lines, the accelerators and technical assistance providers. They know so much more than I ever will. And how do we share our judgment to build that really repeatable, scalable Wisconsin experience, whether you're in Rhineland or Wisconsin, in the Northwoods, on a pontoon, thinking about your startup as the loons dive under your boat, to the hustle and bustle on Water Street in Milwaukee. I think that's the beauty of Wisconsin, is that we are a very diverse geographic state, but our ecosystem knows how to move across our city and county boundaries.
I love that. Yeah. And I've always appreciated your intentionality about the career and about the work. And I think we've talked about that a lot throughout the years. So, with that idea of how Wisconsin is this beautiful place where economic development can take shape and companies can grow within or be attracted to, I still think that when people across the country think about startups and innovation and venture, Wisconsin isn't necessarily the first place that comes to mind. So I'm curious why you think that is. You've talked about a lot of the pluses of being here, but for people who aren't aware, like, why is it that it's sometimes overlooked and why is that not exactly the case?
I think there's a couple of main contributors, but the one I want to focus on is I think it sounds simple, but I think it's the perception gap. And the perception gap is a combination of many factors. So, one, historically and still today, Wisconsin's economic story is not around startups. We are not the center of gravity for what maybe people often think of as a startup, right? That software as a service product that at enterprise scale, it goes from one employee to 100 in months, in short years. And that doesn't really jive with our legacy heritage of manufacturing and agriculture. And on the surface, that's really misaligned, perhaps, disconnected, perhaps. But I think as I've leaned more into this statewide role, I've learned how those sorts of infrastructures of how we grow things, how we build things, and how we take the things that we grow and build and ship them all over the world in the United States, the supply chain and the logistics muscles that we have in this state can help so many startups and technology grow and scale. I think there's also often a big gap between what happens at research institutions and what impacts people's daily lives in who they do business with. And so you think about the University of Wisconsin. I'm a double badger, as you mentioned. I don't know, I bleed red and white, but also green and gold. But when you think about the University of Wisconsin, I think about all of the year after year accolades of being a top 10, top 5 research institute constantly pushing the edges and frontiers of discovery. And sometimes that discovery isn't a new software product that's going to scale into a unicorn. And so I think we have the story and the research. We have this incredible muscle memory of how to grow and build things. And we just haven't woven that narrative, which is a reality in our communities, of how those actually help and serve as dual infrastructure for big legacy business, but also for small, agile, high-tech companies. And that can show up as a deep corporate customer base, strong mobile technical talent, your supply chain that takes your products and builds them, but also it has really contributed, I think, to a really strong angel network as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on in the state, right? And I think sometimes even being in state, we don't necessarily hear about all of these things that are happening, but definitely for people who aren't in Wisconsin, it's that much harder. It's one more step removed to hear about it, unless we're letting people know, which we are today.
Here's another thing I just threw out there, and I can't go, it's been 15 minutes. I can't go 15 minutes without using a sports analogy. So here we go. When I think about hubs of technology and innovation, oftentimes you think about big cities in big states and big economies. And we have the benefit in Wisconsin where we have one NFL team. I was just in Green Bay earlier this week, and you can't go 100 feet without seeing some sort of Green Bay Packers. And that's in the city of Green Bay, but it is also in the homes and hearts of Wisconsinites all throughout the state. We all rally behind one team. Same with the Wisconsin Badgers, right? That's the state's team, whether you went to the university, whether you've ever been to the campus or not. And unlike other states and other cities where you're torn between, the White Sox and the Cubs, the New York Giants and the New York Jets, those same economies and that same split loyalty and that same shared language is split in these big cities. And in Wisconsin, we're one team, one fan base. And that rallying cry, I think, can be part of our secret sauce. It's just you have to know where Wisconsin is and be willing to give us a shot.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I love the kind of analogy with other places of having rivalries within the state versus being unified as a state. With all of the different initiatives and programs and things that are going on to support entrepreneurship or other topics within the state, what's one that you would pick to, that you would want people to know about, especially if they live in Wisconsin?
It's so tough to pick one thing because I'm so excited about many things happening. I think, kind of double clicking on that secret sauce notion, I think the overarching theme that I want folks to think about Wisconsin is like, when you're here, you're home. And when I think about that, it's just about the familiarity and the access to the things that you need, the comfort in which you're able to move. And so, I'll give one example. The Wisconsin Technology Council, another statewide entity, does a lot of gathering. And if you go to any of their luncheons, if you go to one of their summits or one of their pitch competitions, it's like a family reunion. People are hugging and laughing and showing pictures of their kids and their dogs. And it's just a really special feeling. And that's cheesy to say, like, that's the one thing really to know about Wisconsin. But it's super easy to become an insider in Wisconsin. Like, we'll take everyone and you'll find your place here.
Yeah, I totally agree about that. I mean, now celebrating my 10-year anniversary in Wisconsin this year, my husband, Ben, and I talk about that all the time with him starting a small business a couple years ago and just feeling that accessibility of being able to walk into an existing business and meet the owner and have a conversation with them and have them say, like, give me a call and I'll help you out. Like, he's had so many occasions like that where he's like, I was so surprised that the person was accessible and wanted to help me. And it just makes him feel like he's on the right path and like he's going to get the support that he needs. So I totally get what you mean. And just when you said,
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say when you said, when you're here, you're home. I thought you were going to say when you're here, your family is. I think that's like the Olive Garden little theme. So I put that in as an Easter egg for Joe and Troy, who will, I think, love to hear, Wisconsin, just like Olive Garden. When you're here, your family.
Unlimited breadsticks for all.
What were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that reflection of you and Ben talking about that is really special, and I think you're a testament to say, hey, look, we're from southern Florida. Winter is endurable. And like, I think that right in and of itself, of being in the Midwest compared to lots of other places in the US, whenever I go to the coast and I meet folks that have never been to Wisconsin, they're always like, but you have ice and snow for a very long time.
Yeah. For me, the question will be, but what? Why did you move there from Miami? So, and there's a lot of reasons and a lot of the points that we've touched on already today. So yeah, I totally get you. And I hear that argument a lot. And I'm like, there's a lot of reasons why we moved and why we're still here. Well, maybe we can shift a little bit and talk about our current partnership between WEDC and Generator, Accelerate Wisconsin. So, it encapsulates a lot of what we've touched on again, economic development, entrepreneurship, but has kind of a special flair. So how did WEDC decide that it wanted to be involved in a program like this? And why was a soft landing pad set up for international founders the right play?
Yeah, so when I first started, maybe in my first 3 months, so I started in June of 2024, I spent my first 3 months kind of re-engaging with the ecosystem, having been a national focused investor, I had to sort of like reintegrate into the roots here in Wisconsin, and then dive deep into the data and say, like, this is what I think we should be focusing on in Wisconsin. That's the right place for a state entity to be really extending impact. And so what came out of that was focusing on increasing the number of startups that our state could reliably produce. And then you have to say, like, where do we start? And I sort of fell in love with the idea of building density first in small ecosystems. So it's great to add 100 net new startups, but if they're all 3 hours from one another, how do you increase the velocity of their speed to market? How do you enrich that mentor network? And, once you have one successful startup, that creates this flywheel creates talent that's looking for their next startup. So now you have serial founders. You have founders with an exit that maybe are transitioning into an angel role or an LP in a fund. That builds up demand for venture savvy attorneys and venture savvy tax accountants and policy advocacy networks for startups. All of these critical components that really change the game faster than when you scattershot. And so we said, okay, if we can focus on density, let's reroute our initiatives and our programs to say, how do we build density for our homegrown startups, right? That's where we started. That's where you naturally start. Who's already here trying to launch, and how do we help them get faster? And so as we're wondering that, I started to focus on, that's a long play, right? That's a long tail to focus on infrastructure that then helps founders, that then helps their companies grow and exit. That's a 10 to 15, maybe a full generational transformation. But if we're investing in infrastructure, what is the adrenaline that we can plug into those ecosystem partners that all of a sudden exponentially changes how many new startups are coming. And that's when I started looking at my colleagues at WEDC that really focus on business attraction. And I thought, well, why can't we do that? Why can't we think about startups who are mobile? They're 1 to 3 people. They're normally pretty untethered by their product at the early stage. And, you know, at the same time as I was wondering about density and startup attraction, Joe and Troy started sending me emails for this program called the Global Entrepreneurship in Residence, GEIR. And they're like, hey, as you're thinking about your plan, how does this fit? And I think it just sort of aligned on, we can do, you'll laugh at me, like we can do both and. We can invest in our local homegrown startups. I know, you've never heard me say both and before. We can do that for our Wisconsin startups at the same time as helping other founders that are looking for network access, curated introductions, small ecosystems to pilot and grow.
Right.
We didn't have to do anything different.
Accessible places where they can meet other business owners. Like, it's everything that we were talking about before, and you're kind of expanding who gets access to that.
Yes, and you know, I think it added extra confidence. So we started talking about, we've worked together for 7 years, and I was part of the hiring and interview team. Still, yet to this day, I still remember our consideration of that candidate pool. And the thing that stood out most to me about you, Lauren, was how founder focused you were. In the assignments, in the decks that you presented, it was all about the person leading the company. And I'm an extrovert, as I like to say. I love being around people. I think there's just so much brilliance that comes out of connection. And so you just take our personalities and our tendencies and strengths, and then you amplify that through our organizations. Yeah. And like, oh my goodness, that's exactly what a soft landing pad is about. It's about being human-centered about these founders that are navigating all sorts of new things. And it's about being warm, friendly faces that are like, hey, have you ever heard of the Green Bay Packers? Do you want to watch a football game with me? And like being willing to go out for coffee and talk about their business or not, and have that human connection first. And I think it just worked. The opportunity, the timing, and the two entities of Generator and WEDC on what we are good at. I think it made a lot of sense to say, let's try this and see what we can build together. Yeah,
I love that. Okay, I have so many pieces I want to dig in a little bit more about. But first, talk a little bit about like the problem, dive a little bit more into the problem that you were solving. So you talked about, like access to resources for founders, but why the specific bet on bringing international founders to Wisconsin?
Yeah, I think it solves two problems. One of the problems is if we're investing in all of this infrastructure, but our net new startups from Wisconsin aren't increasing at a rapid pace, do we have latency in the infrastructure that we just built? Mm-hmm. That's one problem, right? How do we just get more folks through the resources that we've invested in? I think the second one is, okay, if we were just thinking about any kind of attraction, you might say, well, why aren't you just trying to recruit the Illinois startup to move across the border, the Michigan startup to go across the Great Lakes? I think it goes back to that perception gap that we are talking about. What do you already know about Wisconsin? If you're in the U.S., if you're not in the Midwest and you're not from the Midwest, you probably don't think about the Midwest very often. And so if we were going to double click on this sort of inorganic growth of attraction, acquisition, I didn't think that we could start with in the U.S. attracting them to Wisconsin, because we'd have to work really hard at the narrative shift. Instead, our global message is come to the United States, and Wisconsin can be that soft landing pad for you because we have all of these things. And I think that perception gap is really different for the global founders than a Silicon Valley founder.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you. And then I'm so happy that you brought up the people side of things, because I know we've had a lot of conversations and deep thinking and planning and executing on the people side within the Accelerate Wisconsin program. We know that for any entrepreneur, and especially as you're talking about a sole founder or founder of a very small new startup, there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of loneliness, there's a lot of pressure. It's very difficult, an understatement of the week. But then for founders who are relocating to a place that they may be very unfamiliar with, like not only Wisconsin, but they're unfamiliar with the U.S. as a mix of different cultures, but very different from where they may be coming from. They're now navigating also a different business environment in addition to just personal or maybe family environment, a new legal system. How do you think about the way that founders are navigating that with our support, and how do you see that evolving as we're kind of in the midst of our partnership working on this?
I think it's an ongoing lesson, and we're really practicing the muscle of learning, right?
Yeah.
Because it's both a psychological change, an emotional change, let alone a business change, right?
Yeah.
You already know that they thought this was a good enough business decision to move their lives here for a while. And so the generator programming takes care of the business. And so, I think you and I and our teams have had conversations weekly about what's the stickiness, what's the hook to help them manage the non-business parts of the transition, right? And I think some of it helps to just be an outgoing extrovert, although I sometimes picture myself like my 4-year-old that would, smother a puppy because he just is so happy to see them. And so I have to remind myself that not everyone is extroverts with unbridled curiosity and oozing energy. But I think what I've heard from some of the founders, right, that have come through the program since the fall to the latest session, to the folks that I just met 2 days ago up in Green Bay, is like, it's the little things. They're like, I can't believe you smile and say hello to me every time you see me. and like, it's super simple things, right? Just like, I see you and I remember you. And super simple things of like, okay, I know you have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. So when I see you, I'm going to ask for a picture of them. I'm going to ask, like, it's the end of the school year in the U.S. Are they graduating and what are their summer plans? It's those really simple things that I actually think are the stickiest part about it. Because when you're a founder, you're really brave in your business. Just like you have to have so much courage and determination and agility. And then when you're trying to do that without your
support network. Yeah. I think you're totally right. It makes me think of, little experiences with the past and current cohorts as well. I went to a yoga class with one of the founders. So even I am not an extrovert, I would say I'm an extroverted introvert. And so even going to a yoga class where we didn't talk to each other, but we were practicing next to each other, and then we talked a little bit afterwards, like, how was that, and that kind of stuff. Talking to founders about hard things that are going on in their lives too, and acknowledging that distance that they have from family members, not talking about it and being like, well, it's all fine, but saying like, that's tough being that far from your family. And having to navigate either like, am I traveling or am I not traveling? I think all of those things, like you said, can help support the stress. But, I acknowledge too that, like you said, it's a muscle we're still working out. And I think it's something that every founder in each cohort is teaching us a little bit more about, because, surprise, everybody's different and everybody's circumstance is very different. So they need different things. And so we've found it's not, wraparound services are not like, we can just create a guide or a playbook for one cohort that will map onto all the others, but really like being intentional and listening to their needs. And then I think for me, a big thing is like following up. Like if someone says something and I'm like, oh, I'll look into that for you. It's like, I need to then look into it for them and get back to that, and I think it's surprising, kind of like how you said people will say, wow, you smiled at me, and you're like, oh, not a big thing. Like for me, people will be like, whoa, you actually sent the thing that you said, or you replied and were like, couldn't find it, but I'm going to try and talk to somebody else and see if they can. I think that kind of follow up, it's just like you said, I see you, I acknowledge that this is important, and I want to help. So yeah, I think we're trying. um, yeah, like we've been saying, the partnership, it's been so cool to co-create your word. I think of that as your word as well, and to really work on this together. Both times where we've both been in the room at the same time, and times where you met with the cohort in Green Bay recently. I met with them a little bit earlier. But our organizations are also pretty different. Like you mentioned earlier, we have different strengths that are complementary and really help us work together. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Like what is each side bringing to the equation?
Yeah, so I think on the surface, WEDC brings, of course, the statewide reach and intentionality. I think we have an opportunity and the right, we're at the right level to build alignment across stakeholders to build convenings and interest in this program. And, this one was sort of unexpected as we were starting to build out and roll out Accelerate Wisconsin for other countries and their states or prefectures and provinces. It brought credibility to the program, right? And so as Generator was trying to go into, the Hessen Trade and Invest organization could see that the state of Wisconsin was behind the program and that it wasn't some sort of, global predatory initiative. And I think we underestimated that credibility component that brought, maybe peace of mind for global founders that knew they wanted to go to the US but had never heard of Wisconsin or Madison or Green Bay and maybe had never heard of Generator. I think Generator brings, a history of program execution, a decade plus of that experience and those playbooks evolving. They bring founder level experience and that daily proximity to startups. So, right, like while you're running a cohort in Madison, there's probably a dozen other cohorts running all around the world run by Generator program managers. And those program managers skill one another up constantly. And I think that's something that a single state entity certainly doesn't have. And I think it's difficult to replicate across just if it were multiple different organizations. You all work for a Generator and you're all using the same playbook. And I think that is something that's really beneficial. And then the conversation that we just had about the stickiness, that's new to Generator. That's not necessarily new to WEDC just because we're in the business of attracting and retaining businesses. So I think we're both focused on the system design, but our roles at the levels and range are really different and complementary.
Yeah. Thank you. I agree. So going back, when we started working together, we were specifically and like by name working on social impact. I'm curious if for you, like with whether it's Accelerate Wisconsin or other parts of your work at WEDC, is there a moment where you're like, yes, this is why I do this?
Oh man, I get to have that moment so often. I feel so fortunate to have that sort of dopamine hit all the time.
Yeah.
And I think a simple one, I got a little thank you note from one of the founders that had never been to Wisconsin. She participated in our Accelerate Madison cohort over the winter, right? And her thank you note was just like, I never thought about Wisconsin before, and now I'm really excited to build my business here. And I think a note like that from anyone is really rewarding, but to be able to see that in a really brilliant founder that's just and is from South Korea, which is where I was born. And to have that connection point as women immigrants, to think about what's possible in our state, in our world, and how curiosity and connection can just like change an individual's life, but also like build relationships and connection everywhere. That's just, it's really rewarding, and it's part of public service, whether you're doing it in a public sector job or whether you get to work in a social impact company or fund.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that you took it there to the personal space, because I think it is personal for a lot of us working in the space. I'm like new, 10 years new to Wisconsin. My parents were immigrants to Miami. And I think one of the little moments for me was my mom, she was very sad when I moved away from Miami and moved to Wisconsin. And I think was kind of hoping I'd move back. And in like a more recent, maybe like after the 5-year point, she kind of knew I wasn't going to move back anytime soon. But she said that like now when she tells people about the move, she's like, but I can see why she lives in Wisconsin and why she wants to stay there. So it was cool to have her visit and spend time, and even with the work, like understand what I do a little bit better and see why it means so much to me to do this kind of work with partners like you. So appreciate you for being a part of that. Let's see. So, we've been kind of talking about the partnership more generally. If, let's say, one of these founders that we're discussing is listening in, and it's a founder who's interested in exploring, Wisconsin, whether they're from inside the state, from another state, or from outside the US, what would you want a founder who's kind of like stuck on next steps to hear from this?
I think it's, if you're a founder, you already have the jump instinct, like you jump over those cliffs and you trust your instincts, and you have world changing aspirations for what your idea and tech can do. You don't have to start that brave journey in the hardest, most crowded markets. Sometimes density exists in the absence of that noise. And if you come to Wisconsin, the goal for me is simple. Like, you come here and you get your first check, you get your first customer, and you get your first hire. And you do that through the relationships that we're able to offer you. And on day one, I think it's you're not just exploring the US. Once you have those, you are a part of it and you're operating in it.
Shayna. Yeah, I think, again, I've always loved your intentionality around the work that you do. You go so deep to understand the space that you're in and to make a true impact with people. And I have always appreciated that and admired it. So appreciate you sharing today. Thank you for taking the time to talk and dive into our partnership a little bit more. And I look forward to the next time we catch up.
I do too. Thank you so much, Lauren.